I believe the purpose of this session is not only to see how a national institution and a local institution works together, but also how applied research turns into practice, and how this can lead to real impact. And I think that's what you all are looking for, is results. You heard from Adi earlier this morning. He did a great job describing how Brookings Metro works, how we collaborate with local leaders. I want to add one other dimension to that, I think, which is really important. We have opportunities to work with many local leaders and institutions across the country, but we're actually kind of selective, and we're selective in this one way, which is that Brookings Metro isn't just interested in being a thought leader. We're also interested in being a practice leader, in the sense that oftentimes what we're doing is working with local leaders to co-create new strategies for the field. I know we all talk about best practices, but given how how trends change, how leadership changes, and how stubborn actually structural challenges are, we sometimes need new solutions. And so what we're interested in is not just providing technical assistance, but really partnering with groups like EDC and now this center to kind of co-create new strategies in ways that are going to be certainly catalytic locally, but have an influence to the field and therefore can actually shape federal policy. And that's the exciting opportunity we have now in this next round. So Mark, say hello to everyone.
Hey everyone, I think a lot of the audience is here in San Diego, and as I was looking through the names, I know a lot of folks, but equally enthusiastic, Amy, to have a chance to talk with you today. For those of you I don't know, my name is Mark Cafferty. I'm the president and CEO of the San Diego Regional Economic Development Corporation, and we've partnered with Brookings, I'm guessing about 8 years now, on various elements of our work as we as an organization have tried to figure out what economic development means in San Diego, try to get connected to the right places across the country and around the world who are doing good work. And we found a really incredible partnership with and through Brookings that I know we're going to get a chance to talk about today. But it's been that many years, and it really, Amy, has been working with you and your team that entire time. And so look forward to recapping a little of that with the group today.
Great, that sounds good. So I talked about how we, Mark actually brought it back to 8 years ago. So let's start there. 8 years ago, 2012, Mark, you were just coming into your role at EDC. And as a country, we were just in the midst of recovering from the last recession. So there's a lot of similarities to the discussion today. And so what I'm going to jump to here is that we partnered with EDC and the San Diego community around one new practice called global trade. Let me give you a little bit of context for that. After the Great Recession, there was enormous focus on jobs, and job creation, economic recovery, and how to create a different kind of economic growth model that wasn't just focusing on housing and consumption. Well, Brookings Metro, as a national think tank, put out a framework that said one of the things we ought to do is not to grow our jobs from local demand, because local demand was down, but to focus on traded sectors and demand globally, and how, even though San Diego is a binational region, that we as a country were under leveraging our global trade relationships as a source of economic growth. So we put out a framework, and we put out data, Adi and others, on the extent to which our regional economies were exporting, the extent to which they were globally connected, and how to take advantage of those relationships. And based on that framework and 100 Metro data, we decided to work with a handful of places to act on that data. Like, what would it take to double exports in 5 years? And so we came to San Diego to work on a global trade and competitiveness strategy. So Mark, describe that experience. What did Brookings bring to you on that? What did that lead to?
Interesting. So I was telling Amy earlier, and it was kind of an interesting moment, fairly special moment for me when I think back on it, because one of my mentors and someone who a lot of folks on the phone will know, Dwayne Roth, who was the leader of Connect, among other things. Dwayne was an executive in the region and had chaired our board, had chaired the Biocom board. But I was lucky enough when I came into this role to really work closely with Dwayne. And there were a lot of people around me who were saying that we need to look at the region's economic development strategies and figure out how we become more global in our approach. And Dwayne came to me and said, there's this initiative that Brookings is doing. It's called the Global Cities Initiative, and they're going to be up in LA on a certain day. And I'm going to convince them that they've got to come down to San Diego to talk to us. But he told me my job, in his own words, was to muscle our way into this Global Cities Initiative, because what we wanted to be was part of the discussions with these other cities on how trade and foreign investment was being done the right way, or what the right strategies look like, because we're a vibrant binational region here. You can't be in San Diego and not understand how important Mexico is to the economy, how important Mexico is to the culture, how much our region is one region. But at that time when that study came out, Amy, that you're talking about, we were woefully underperforming in exporting, and we were woefully underperforming in foreign investment. The state of California wasn't, but San Diego was. So it was really easy to sort of zero in and say, if all this foreign investment is pouring into California and all this trade is happening with California, why is San Diego not seeing its fair share of it? And part of it was because we hadn't had any concrete strategies to tackle those issues. So companies that were operating globally were doing good work on their own. We had a World Trade Center, but by that time it was kind of not really functioning the way it once had. And we had some universities that were doing outreach and connecting in different places, but we had no concrete strategy as a region that had us dialing in on something like exports that we could actually measure, and dialing in on foreign investment, which we could actually measure and see, could we start to perform better in the way that we thought that we should be able to. And that was the kickoff of our relationship with all of you. And you mentioned data. It started with data. Data helped us build the strategies. But my favorite part about working with all of you is we have to implement that on the ground here. So once the research is done and once the data is there, we had to come up with the strategies locally and sell our board on these being the right things that could help us move the needle in the economy. And years later, those strategies are the full backbone of the World Trade Center that we have functioning in San Diego through our port, city, and airport, but in conjunction and in partnership with EDC.
Yeah, Mark, and I think one of the things that as you moved into strategy development, Brookings really tries not to be the top down. We don't want to tell you what the strategies ought to be. I think we create an environment and a place for you all to bring stakeholders together with a common language and set of information that then can inform what makes sense for your institutions. But Mark, I think the other part of this curriculum was that you got to be part of a cohort of other cities that were putting together similar strategies. What was the benefit of that?
It was great benefits in that. I remember we were getting a chance to see, Portland was a little ahead of us in their work with you. We were getting to see some of what they did. It connected us better to LA. And obviously the economies of LA and San Diego are different, but intertwined in some key ways. But it was the first effort for us to get in with cities like Indianapolis and Nashville and others who kind of have continued to play important roles that I know that we'll talk about in a bit, but to really see not necessarily just the EDOs or the economic development organizations from those places, but uniquely who was trying to tackle global trade, who was trying to tackle global investment. And the thing that we found so valuable, in addition to the data, the connection of Brookings that could seemingly kind of connect us very quickly to another place, was finding a peer network of individuals and organizations who are trying to do the same thing. Different economies, different demographics, but really trying to figure out how their economy could get better connected in the right ways to international markets to draw the activity in that would generate more jobs locally. And sometimes we found that the right peer in a particular place was through the mayor's office in that place. And other times it might be the person leading the chamber. And other times it may be a nonprofit that was stood up to do that work, in partnership with labor and community organizations. But we kept finding these individuals and organizations who we really could have this dialogue with, without it being what is sometimes a stereotypical economic development dialogue, which is just every region telling you how great they already are. This was a group of regions that were coming together because they knew that they had big real world issues to tackle. They knew that they had big real world opportunities there. And again, and in Dwayne's own words, we wanted to be part of that network. We wanted to be at the table, one of the cities and regions having that discussion, share our binational story, but take away as much as we could from the other people in the room. And some of the very best things we do today, and some of the very best, contacts that we've maintained have come from that early work in that network.
And I would say to all of you is that because of that engagement with San Diego and EDC early on, San Diego's plan became one of the most visible and prominent among the dozens of cities we actually worked with. And what's so interesting is, as part of that, we ended up working with Mayor Villaraigosa at the time, who was head of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. And because of this work, two dozen city mayors announced that they were going to undertake global trade and investment strategies. So San Diego became part of a sort of a pioneering group of communities around this work, and that caught the attention of the Department of Commerce. And that goes back to the conversation we had earlier about the federal bridging. And all of a sudden, the trade office and the Commerce Department and the policy shop all of a sudden took attention to what all these cities were doing and ended up joining all of our meetings. So they could figure out how their programming and successive legislation and appropriations could support basically bottom-up work. And a lot of it is around how do companies build the capacity to do more work abroad. I'm going to pivot to what came next. Mm-hmm. So I would just say first, this was a group of cities that created for the first time global export trade and competitive strategies. But Mark, I would say that one of the things that I learned, and I think this goes back to some of the conversations you all want to have about federal investments, is you might start narrow and programmatic, mm-hmm. but that narrow and programmatic actually exposed culture shifts and behavior shifts that we did not anticipate. So we went into this thinking, we're going to use this economic moment to, say, double exports and double the volume of income in our community through trade as an economic driver. And what it actually forced us to do was not focus on business attraction, mm-hmm. but focus on existing companies.
Absolutely right.
What they make, what are their innovation inputs. Then it reminded us about the importance of talent. Then it reminded us the importance of infrastructure investment. And all of a sudden, a conversation about exports ended up about how do we invest in homegrown assets as critical to economic competitiveness. And what happened is, as we did that work, we realized, and that the national conversation began to pivot this way, was that the economy 10 years after the recession wasn't benefiting everyone. And for all the talk about economic competitiveness and focus on talent and focus on all these drivers, there's somehow inequality was continuing to widen. So now we had to go back and really think hard about how these economic strategies could be more intentional about equity and inclusion. And I will tell you, this was now the next generation of reform for the field. And what happened? San Diego became at the epicenter of just 3 cities that worked with Brookings on how to reinvent inclusive economic growth. And Mark, I would say the reason why San Diego ended up in the small cohort with Brookings to invent inclusive economic development and change the practice of inclusive economic growth was because you guys did it again. You guys came into us and said, we have a new chair from Northrop Grumman, yep. and they charge EDC to think differently, and how can Brookings help? Do you remember that?
Yeah, no, I absolutely do. And there's a couple of things.
I think we came to the same conclusion you did. So tell us about the journey you made from global trade to inclusive growth.
Well, you described it beautifully, and I'll try to. I tend to be long-winded for those who know me, so I'll try to be as concise as I can. But it was a fascinating time. So we were seeing our exports expand, and we were seeing more foreign investment come in, and we were getting our handle around a strategy that would work for San Diego. And we very quickly felt like we could hold our own in that dialogue now with anyone. And we would go to these Brookings network meetings. And I remember being at one in DC. And I remember then Mayor Reed of Atlanta and Mayor Fisher of Louisville were on stage. And I remember the actual line that just kind of stopped me dead in my tracks. It was after Ferguson had happened, and there was kind of some court issues happening around the time that we were at an event in DC. And I think Mayor Reed was actually asked to speak about Atlanta's international work and their export plans and things of that nature. And I remember him saying, I could talk to you about exports all day long, but if we don't stop for a minute to address what's happening in our cities right now, then we're really not talking about what's critical for our cities at this moment. And I remember him saying, we're going to wake up one morning and we're going to have 20 Fergusons happening in this country overnight on the same day. And he said, and Mayor Fisher did a beautiful job of following him on this, he said, and if any of you think that that is solely a police and community issue and you don't recognize it as a jobs issue, and you don't recognize it as an economic issue, then you're not leading in this space. That's exactly what he said. And then Mayor Fisher, for any of you know him from Louisville, was equally articulate in agreeing with that. And they kind of broke stride in that conversation, and it became a conversation about our urban cores. And while a guy like me could go out and talk about all the surging indicators, the reality that a rising tide was not lifting all boats, and that maybe it never had. Maybe that strategy actually never worked. And we came home thinking about that. And Amy, I remember, a phone call from you shortly after that. But simultaneously, our new chair, Jim Zortman, who was the senior vice president of Northrop Grumman at the time, he was the individual who was leading their unmanned systems division in San Diego. He was a former 3-star admiral who was what they refer to as the air boss in San Diego. He was the admiral in charge of flight. And he was respected heavily in both of those worlds, military community, business community, for that work. He was becoming our chair, and our chair serves a 2-year point in time. And we went out to meet with him to find out what we thought his key strategy was going to be. And we thought it might be a continued focus on military and defense. We thought maybe it would be tech heavy because of the work that Northrop was doing. And to our surprise, he wanted it to be around inclusion and equity. And what he told us was a story of the years that he was leading in the military. And those years coinciding with some years where military leadership was recognizing the complete inequity in the officer and enlisted rank in the military. And he talked about all the work that the military did to try to create programs to help get more people of color and more women into the ranks of officers, and get the officer ranks reflecting the enlisted ranks, and getting both of them as groups to reflect the American people that they served and protected and represented. And he'll talk about all the work that they did, and then he'll say, and then we sent that generation off to war for a long time. And regardless of what anyone feels politically about the conflicts that we've been in, his words to me were, there's no denying that that was the most diverse military we have ever put out there representing the United States. And with all the challenges that they had in front of them in the worst possible circumstances, they performed exactly as we wanted them to do. And his message to us was, if it can work there, then it can work everywhere, and it certainly can work in San Diego. And he wanted to start a dialogue by pushing his corporate peers to say, this isn't something that we can just talk about anymore. This is something that we need to address. And so he really kicked that off at a time when it was becoming something that I know you cared about deeply. And through that, we got exposed to a group of people, again, that you brought together around the table that really changed the way we see and do economic development.
Yeah, Mark, and let me just elaborate on that. And it goes back to what's the Brookings role in something like that. And so what we heard was, we started to hear from Mark and peers of his around the country who became very committed as business groups, CEO groups, economic development entities that said, we are job creators, we are the economic agenda setters for our communities. We have an obligation to make sure that the way we shape our economic agenda really does benefit everyone, but we don't know how to do this. And it was a very honest conversation, just kind of like what you're hearing today, which is, what does racial equity mean in our organization? So this was, I don't remember what year this was, but a group of folks came and said, Brookings, we really need you to do a research on what is the business case for inclusive economic growth? What is the literature? And in some ways, we hear a lot of literature about how if we embraced equity and inclusion, it would be good for the economy, but it's too academic. it doesn't really resonate locally. So can you bring it down a notch and create a framework and a business case that we can use locally to bring our board to this work, and then to help us evaluate how our internal organizations and institutions and our partnerships change as a result? And so we brought three basically economic development entities together and their community leaders. This is San Diego, Nashville, and Indianapolis, to have a very, very honest conversation, one that we had not experienced with groups, around what does it mean to operationalize inclusion into an economic development model. And that was a 6-month, 9-month, what we call a lab with 3 different cities. Mark, what were your big takeaways from that whole facilitated exercise?
Yeah, I remember when we went into that. I think the time frame, Amy, was like 2014 to 16-ish was around the time that we were starting to have those discussions, and I think that is when Jim came in as, or really close to that time, as our chair. And we had really good luck in this cohort model with you already, and we had pretty good luck in sort of saying, Brookings helped us craft a plan. We didn't have to implement it, but we chose to, and it was working. So if they're going to bring folks together again, maybe they can help us think this through and help us figure it out, and we can compare and contrast that. I mean, on the surface, Nashville and Indianapolis sound like remarkably different places and economies to San Diego, but what you find when you get into the dialogue with everyone is that inequality is inequality, and economies are economies. And so while the players and the types of organizations and the types of clusters we have and the demographics and the history of racism and things of that nature may look different and feel different in the places, ultimately where we are today and what we're trying to tackle and what we're trying to address has very, very similar undercurrents. And it's something that we found great value in right out of the gate, just being able to have an open dialogue. Our first thought was, what role can an EDC even play in this? Is this really a role? For those of you who I don't know, I spent 20 years of my career before coming to EDC working in the workforce systems in Boston and San Diego. And when you do that work, whether you're doing it as direct service or you're working for the workforce board that's putting money out to the direct service providers, you feel very connected to the communities that have historically been disconnected to economic opportunity and growth. But when you run an economic development organization, you don't. And historically, we were not in any rooms in any neighborhoods in San Diego where this dialogue was happening. And you don't just walk into them. You don't just walk into rooms where people have been focused on equity and inclusion and worker justice and social justice for decades and kind of say, okay, we're here with the big businesses to be part of the dialogue now. And even when you do wade into that the right way, you should be ready, and you should be fully accepting of taking it on the chin a little bit from folks who know that the people who our organization has represented for the last 60 years have been around in the banks, in the major political positions, the major business positions that have in a lot of ways probably exacerbated the challenges that we're all trying to address today. And having a few other organizations in different places to have that dialogue with was important for us, because we could speak pretty freely to each other. We could compare and contrast what we were dealing with kind of at a local level and learn from each other. And along the way, you then connected us to a wider network of folks who are trying to tackle the same issue, whose organizations might not have looked like ours. And I remember the first few meetings of those groups was fairly tense. I remember leaving a couple of the Brookings meetings, because these were always in person, sort of feeling like, wow, I mean, I don't know that we're really going to fit with this group. And years later, the very people who I had the tensest sort of exchange and vibe from are the ones who I absolutely unequivocally value the most and consider not just colleagues, but dear, dear friends who've really helped us with where we've been trying to get to and where we're continuing to try to get to.
So Mark is referring to the 3 cities that did implement inclusive economic development strategies. We wanted their learnings to influence other cities. So we created something called the Brookings Network on Economic Inclusion, where community groups like backbone organizations like EDCs, all got together because they all care about economic inclusion. You realize there's a lot of different intermediaries that are in this space, and we brought everyone together. And it was a very, as Mark said, a tense conversation around what is the role of race and racism in economic growth strategies.
And regions that even didn't want to use the word racism, in other regions that were saying, then leave the room. Like, I mean, it was that frank. It was, if we're not going to have a discussion about what we're really talking about, let's just not do it at all. And that's what I think was so powerful.
Yep. And I would just say, just going back to the inclusive economic growth work, what Brookings did was bring, because of this work, we actually created the Metro Monitor, where we now have for 100 metros, every year we put out in a dashboard that tells every region to what extent their growth was inclusive, including growing incomes and neighborhoods or people and incomes by race, and improving incomes by race and neighborhood. But anyway, so we can create a product as a result of this work. But what we did was we gave each of the 3 cities data so that they could create a narrative. Now, I think that what you all probably take for granted is most chambers and economic development organizations are boosters about their economy. It's always good and strong and prosperous in their branding. It's not usual for economic development leaders to actually have an honest depiction of the economy. And it was basically empowering these groups to use data to create a different narrative. One that said, as the economic, shop, here's how we see the economy, and then how do we go to our community nonprofits and partners, and do they see themselves in this agenda? Does this make sense? And it created a level of trust, I think, Mark, for you all and some of your community groups. And I now am so impressed, and this goes back to the impact. I tell people now that San Diego EDC's inclusive economic growth strategy that he's done with many of you all around small business investment, training, and workforce from Native local populations, and even the affordability of thriving families. Like, I think it's one of the best plans on inclusive growth in the country, and I talk about it all the time, which now brings me to the 3rd phase, which is the one we're in. Back to the point I made earlier, is that I think San Diego is always on the cutting edge of pushing the field around where the next generation of strategies, the next generation of policies are going to go. What's the unfinished business, Mark? What do you think this work with the new policy center in Brookings, what would you like to see it yield?
So, yeah, and I agree with you 100%. I feel like this is our third opportunity to really work with you and get your input and your support in helping us sort of think through what things can and should look like here. When we created this narrative, when we created sort of the 3 goals that Amy just referenced with many of you, there's probably dozens of people on this call who were influential on that. We did it around sort of like these 3 data points that we wanted to bring back and really kind of push at home to get the EDC board and investors, quite honestly, to recognize that if we were going to play any role in this, it couldn't just be business as usual in any way for us. It couldn't just be with the usual partners, and it couldn't just be the usual work. And I remember when Nakia Clark from our team presented in a board meeting, and she stood up and she told our board, which is quite large, that right now, I just want you to hear these stats. As we speak, 1 in 3 San Diegans is Latino, was the first stat she shared with them. The second was that 98% of our businesses are small businesses, and those businesses struggle to compete and retain the talent because of the influence of bigger businesses in the region. And at that point in time, with an indicator that she had that you all had worked with us on, she showed that fully more than 50% of our population was living below a threshold of self-sufficiency. So not necessarily in poverty, but not a place where any of us would agree that they were comfortably living in San Diego. And she looked to our board and she said, if we're going to tackle these issues as EDC, we need to look around the room and recognize that 1 in 3 of you is not Latino. None of you represent small businesses, and nobody in this room is living below a threshold of self-sufficiency. So if we're going to take this on and we're going to do anything to bring businesses to the table, we have to do it through the organizations that have been doing this work and know and understand this work. And that's where that journey began. And I think if you fast forward to today, one of those key issues in there, those households living below the level of self-sufficiency, or what we now focus on when it comes to thriving households, when you dig in deeper to that issue, There are massive housing issues in San Diego, but beyond the cost of housing, there are massive transportation, transit, and infrastructure issues that impact people. There are childcare issues that impact people. There is a lack of access to healthcare that's impacting people. And there are environmental factors around all of that that are hitting certain communities much, much harder than they hit other communities. And so when you think of those issues, those are big policy issues. We are not a big policy shop. We're a team of 22 at EDC, and I commonly say back to our board, here's what I think we can do as a team of 22 to move the needle in the economy, leveraging the support of our investors. But to take on things like this, we need to really rely on the people who do this work in the region already, and there are many, but I think welcome the support of this center that's being created to really help us think about one thing where I think we have not been performing well, except in a couple of particular areas where we've seen this work. But how do we take those bigger issues that I just talked about and figure out where and when federal dollars and federal support and help from Washington can come in and really help us address what we're dealing with on the ground in San Diego? I have great faith that the partnership that's been put together by the county and by Brookings and by the San Diego Foundation and other partners is going to help San Diego do a lot of really, really important work in the next few years because of that.
Mark, and I will just close before we turn it back to Shalini for Q&A, is that what I hope you hear is, A, you all are investment ready. You have the capacity to bring together complex partnerships around some big goals. And what the two periods that we talked about, we didn't have the benefit of unprecedented federal investments. So now you have a readiness, I think, to around some big goals and a federal partner. And so I do think it's an exciting time for San Diego, and hopefully you'll hear from Adi and Joe Kane and Jenny how we are excited about continuing the partnership we've had with EDC to the rest of you around this next phase. Shalini?
This was absolutely fantastic. I'm going to ask folks to turn their cameras back on so we can see any raised hands and other things. But I want to kick off with first a comment and then a question. The comment is, wow, we are standing on your shoulders. And what I love most about your conversation just now is how you didn't shy away at all from the really hard things. I think that's going to be incredibly important for the work of the center. Everything we are doing is going to be a challenge in the current environment, coming out of a pandemic with people's lives upended. I want to ask you both how you dealt with the early stages of fear that go with tackling really big problems. I always have the sensation of like you pull a thread and you unravel a whole sweater, which just sounds like exactly what happened when you started on exports and ended up on racism. And so can you talk a little bit about how you just got the gumption to go at it and follow it until its logical conclusion? Mark, I'll start with you.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, if you don't walk through and trace the history, it does sound like a really an interesting leap from one place to the next. But I have to say that being in it through those years, it wasn't, because I think Amy touched on something, and it was something I believe when I took this job, or I wouldn't have taken this job. I do feel that at the end of the day, what economies are about is talent and labor and the individuals doing the work. And yes, innovation and the people who create companies, and we are so blessed with what we have in San Diego, but the ability for those companies to grow, hinges so heavily on talent being in the region that can help them grow. And from a workforce development background, or anyone for that matter who looks at these issues, that talent, that no strategy can be that we just hope that talent comes from somewhere else. If we are a great region, that talent will come from San Diego because we will invest in it at the points in time when we need to. And like every region, we have not invested enough. We have not invested enough in that local talent. So I felt like an underlying piece of all of it was that piece. I do think, though, that the comfort for me was this peer network that Brookings brought us together with. There's some pretty courageous people in that group. And so you could have honest discussions. I would sit and I would talk about what we were about to do. And I would literally have my peers in another city say, you're going to lose members over that. You're going to get fired. I mean, we actually have people say, and our thought was, we're already getting our board to recognize that the biggest economic cornerstone that we have in the region is talent. And if we can get them to recognize that now the investment in that talent means investing in communities we've long ignored or investing in opportunities that we've just missed. And so that on the inclusion front allowed us to sort of really, I think, keep it at the end of the day around a talent discussion. And then when you weave in the changing demographics and the nature of our businesses and what everybody sees as a quickly unattainable cost of living within this region for people who want to be able to live in and thrive in San Diego, we did lose a few members along the way, but we gained far, far more, to be honest with you. And keep in mind that our investment base is large businesses. So they could have walked away, and they will walk away at any moment that they think what we're focusing on isn't in fact moving a needle in the economy. And right now, they're staying at the table through the pandemic, mind you, believing the types of things that we were focusing on pre-pandemic, we only need to double down on now because things have gotten that much more challenging.
That's so encouraging. Amy, do you? Yeah.
Yeah, what I would say too on risk is that, for Brookings, I feel that what we learn from local leaders is they themselves want to be thought leaders. They themselves want to be ahead of the curve. They themselves, you all want to make sure you're working on the right things. And so I think a lot of times the partnership with Brookings is, us giving you the tools to look around the corner, to make sure you're not falling behind the times. Because if you're leaders lead. Leaders set objectives that inspire others to follow. And so I feel like that's our role. And I think that's the way we partner with Place. And it can be sometimes a lonely experience, which is why we then bring a cohort of peers who are kind of co-creating it in real time, so it doesn't feel like such a lonely experience, because it's hard work. And this is culture change. And a lot of times it's not even about the strategy, it is about the civics. It's about how do you collaborate, what's the role of the institutions, how do you design, how do you create a table of trust, how do you, Shalini, the question you asked earlier, how do you balance near-term objectives with longer term? And coaching people along and all that, those are half the conversations we have with our local leaders. I'll just say the other big takeaway, just watching how San Diego has risen to the moment, is that you all have been sort of a little bit long-term oriented around metrics.
Yep.
I think the KPI goals is really important. I think it's so easy in a local conversation to say, I'm drowning with all these federal investments, I don't even know where to start.
Yep.
Right? And rather than have the money guide your discussion, it's more important to say, where do we want to be, with this generational investment? What do we want this community to look like on environmental resilience 5 or 10 years from now? And let's pick 1 or 2 goals.
Yep.
And what Mark Cafferty did was he didn't pick, you all as a community didn't try to boil the ocean. You picked 3 numbers to move. And when you pick 3 goals, it actually inspires other people to kind of brainstorm and come to the table. And this is how I help. And here's a different way of designing the collaborations. And it creates 1,000 flowers to bloom in the marketplace and the civic marketplace, which is actually what you need right now with all of our institutions in the city, in the county, in our neighborhoods, the CDFIs, all of them are going to get unprecedented investments. How do you get everyone rowing in the same direction? Yeah. And I think that's the opportunity you all have from this. I think that what the lessons I've learned is being alongside San Diego.
That's fantastic, Amy. And it resonates so much with my experiences over the last decade with the Brookings Metro team from in federal government and then writing and researching with you all. And I think one of the things I value most is the ability to take a need or a desperate problem or a very broad vision and translate it into something answerable. Because that strategic missing middle is really hard. You can say we want to be climate resilient, but what does that look like in practice on the ground? Yep. And for whom? And so I think for this whole audience, I love that, first of all, I love for everybody who's listening, how much applause you have gotten for your leadership to date, because we are genuinely a thriving region. That does not mean we don't have challenges and needs. And so I think, Mark, you really hammered that home. But what I love about what you both just did is you took these intractable problems and you took the idea of data and hammered them together into something really practical. And I see that as a core of the center. We're not going to do all things, but what we want to do incredibly well and know that we're making progress at it. So I think one of the things I want to just leave everyone with as they've been listening to you is how much you really rolled up your sleeves to work out the process of making progress along the way. What would you say is the one most important thing you would leave all of our participants with today to be successful collaborators?
So, wow. I mean, you know, I love the moments that I love San Diego most are the moments when you really feel the collaboration. And I think in our greatest moments, you look around and you see that an awful lot of people came together to kind of move something. For us, for me, you need to keep in mind that 30, 40, 50 businesses and universities and community colleges and civic leaders crafted everything that we could talk to you about in regards to inclusion so that EDC could move forward with a economic development agenda that had inclusion as a cornerstone and an economic imperative because of that level of collaboration. But the collaboration outside of just our leaders here extended. Amy, you'll remember the only traveling that we've done outside of global trade missions is we've gone to the other cities only to visit the other cities who've been doing this work with us. So as we've taken small groups, 20, 30 key business leaders, we've only visited Indianapolis, we've only visited Nashville, Louisville, Atlanta, the cities that we have been having this dialogue with through Brookings, because we could say to all of them, we don't want to hear from the people who will tell us how great your city and your region are. We can read that. Can you tell us about all of the challenges that you either haven't overcome or you're trying to overcome, or who the key partners were who had to come together? And one thing I will say in closing is, there was a point in time where in a lot of those discussions, I would hear about the role that the community foundation was playing in another place. And I would say, you heard me, Amy, I would say, God, I wish our local community foundation was playing that role. And I have to say, if you fast forward to today, we now have a community foundation that's playing that role, not just because of what they're doing here, but because of the leadership that they took on throughout COVID and in the surrounding time and in this sort of economic recovery that we're in. That was a piece that we saw in other places, we knew was a missing piece here, and now we feel like that's becoming one of our strengths, one of our very, very strengths in the collaboration that we get to build on the ground here. So those are the things that you start to see over the course of the time when I think you stay the course and you're really willing to kind of be honest with what the collaboration needs to look like.
So Shalini, I'll just quickly add that there's an opportunity now with these federal investments to take what Mark said and notch it up tenfold. Again, going back to the federal investments, it's going to be, the scale is huge and the breadth. I mean, all kinds, governments, training providers, nonprofits, housing providers, so many groups are going to have new investments or new capacities. So to me, this is about how to use information and democratize it so that it's not, this new information through this policy center isn't just for the privileged few who've been in the traditional leadership roles, but that it really empowers everyone in community to step forward, to democratize information and really just make sure that the process is inclusive. We have so many people now. I think the demand right now for a lot of these Build Back Better dollars is to address historic inequalities and challenges that pre-existed the pandemic. So that does mean underrepresented groups, voices, actually may have access to resources or can help shape these investments or deliver the investments to their community members. So they can be great partners in this change. So I just think there's just huge opportunities to take what you've done and just go further.
That is a fantastic call to action. And I think I said this yesterday in our press event, which was returning to the status quo pre-pandemic would be such a failure of imagination. We have such a huge opportunity here. And so I cannot thank you both enough for both laying the trail of breadcrumbs that brought us to the center, but also really showing us how it's done and being so open and clear-eyed about where the hard work lies.